I first realized something was wrong when I woke up and stepped out onto my porch, only to see a fresh line of dirt slicing across the back of my property like a miniature canyon carved overnight. A trench wide enough for a grown man to lie in, deep enough to twist an ankle ran across the far edge of my yard in a perfect arc. I hadn't dug it. No one had permission to dig it. And yet it stretched across my land as if someone believed they owned the place. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the early morning light casting long shadows inside the cut, making it look even deeper. The birds were still chirping, the air was still cool, but the quiet felt wrong, violated. My land had been touched by hands that didn't belong there. I grabbed my boots and walked the length of the trench. Boot prints, fresh ones, wheelbarrow tracks, a rake mark. Someone hadn't just dug this. They'd taken their time. They'd planned it. I ran my hand along the disturbed edge. The soil hadn't even settled yet. This had happened hours ago, maybe minutes. When I reached the end of the trench, I found something worse. A wooden survey stake hammered into the ground with fluorescent tape wrapped around it, the kind HOAs love to use when they're trying to claim land that isn't theirs. Tied to it was a laminated tag reading Property Line Review, HOA, Action Required. My land wasn't even inside their HOA, not by mistake, not by oversight. When I bought this acreage years ago, it was deliberately outside their borders. I didn't want committees, votes, rules about what color my siding could be, or anyone telling me what kind of truck I could park in my own driveway. It was one of the reasons I bought the place, peace, autonomy, but now it felt like the HOA had wandered across the invisible fence they'd created for themselves. What made it worse was the knowledge that whoever dug the trench hadn't cared whether I slept 10 feet away, or whether my dogs barked, or whether my cameras caught them. They assumed they owned the space simply because they wanted to. I called Sheriff Daniels, the only lawman I trusted in this county. We'd known each other for years, long before he wore a badge. He arrived 20 minutes later, stepping out of his cruiser with a heavy sigh and a look that already told me he knew who was responsible. He walked the trench, studied the stake, checked the tag, and rubbed a hand across his chin like he was trying to decide how stupid someone had to be to do something like this. "This is HOA work," he said finally. "I know," I answered. "They trespassed. They vandalized. They dug without permission." "This isn't just trespassing," he said, pointing at the depth. "This is excavation. If someone had fallen in, if you or your livestock got hurt, they'd be liable for personal injury. They don't have the authority to dig on anyone's land. So what now?" Daniels called dispatch, logged the report, documented the trench with a dozen photos, and shook his head. "I'm gonna have a talk with Callahan. He's behind this. He's been trying for years to force this land into their HOA. He wants jurisdiction, control. Some men get intoxicated on power. He gets intoxicated on paperwork." I walked beside him as he paced. "Sheriff, this wasn't a message. This was groundwork. They're planning something." "I know," he said. "And I'm shutting this down." He told me to stay put while he visited the HOA office. But curiosity won. I mounted a camera on the barn, reviewed last night's footage, and there they were, 3 HOA board members slipping across my land around midnight, carrying shovels, measuring wheels and stakes. They whispered like criminals, checking maps and pointing at imaginary lines as if they were explorers staking out new territory. I recorded everything. I wanted every second of that for when things escalated, not if. When Daniels returned 2 hours later, I could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I talked to them," he said. "They're claiming they dug the trench because they suspected your land was causing water runoff onto HOA property. That's a lie. Of course it is." And I told them trespassing again means arrests will be made. What did they say to that? He exhaled sharply. Callahan said, and I quote, "We'll keep doing what's necessary to protect our community." Protecting their community meant invading mine. Protecting their community meant destroying boundaries, digging trenches, and pretending they were above the law. Protecting their community meant they had declared some kind of silent war. Document everything, Daniel said before leaving. If they come back, call me immediately. Don't confront them alone. They want you to snap. They want a reason to paint you as the aggressive one. Once he left, I walked the property again. The trench was ugly, sure, but what bothered me wasn't the dirt. It was the intent, the assumption, the arrogance of men who believed they owned my time, my land, my peace. That night, I sat on my porch with a shotgun resting across my lap, not to threaten anyone, but because I knew the psychology of people like the HOA board. They never stop at one violation. They test boundaries like children, seeing how far they can push before the grown-up snaps. I turned on my floodlights, checked my cameras, and watched the tree line. By 2 a.m, a pair of figures appeared at the edge of the woods. They weren't digging this time. They were observing, measuring reactions, taking notes. They didn't step onto my land, not fully, but they wanted me to know they were there, wanted to show that my property had become their interest. I stared back, expressionless, holding my shotgun in plain view, not pointed at them, not raised, but present. They stayed for almost a minute, then slipped away silently. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't going to blow over. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't even about land. It was about control. And people willing to trespass under cover of night were capable of far worse in daylight. The HOA had crossed the line, and I was about to draw a thicker one. The days that followed were unsettlingly quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the kind that settles over a battlefield after both sides retreat to decide their next move. I didn't trust it. HOA types never back off permanently. They regroup, re-strategize, and return with a new angle. I spent my mornings checking the footage from the previous night, my afternoons repairing fence posts I suspected they had intentionally loosened, and my evenings scanning the edges of the woods from my porch. I'd lived on this land long enough to know what normal looked like, and this was not normal. On the 4th day, around 9:30 a.m, that silence broke when a silver SUV rolled to a halt near my mailbox. 2 men stepped out, both wearing neon safety vests too clean to belong to real workers. They looked like actors playing contractors' clipboards in hand, khaki pants with no stains, boots that looked freshly purchased. They never looked at the house. They made a beeline straight for the fence line like they already knew exactly where they wanted to pretend to stand. I walked toward them, stopping a few feet short. "You on my land?" I asked. "No, sir," one replied without glancing at me. "We're conducting a boundary compliance survey requested by the Homeowners Association." "Requested by them," I said, "but not authorized by me." The second man checked his laminated map like a stage prop. "We're within public access." "That road is public," I said calmly, "but that grass under your boots is mine." "Step back." They hesitated. Not because they cared about trespassing, they didn't, but because they weren't prepared for someone who knew exactly where the property line was. After exchanging quick looks, they backed away and got into their SUV. That afternoon, Sheriff Daniels returned, looking weary. "You're being set up," he said. "The HOA petition claiming your land impacts the drainage for their subdivision. They want access rights for safety and environmental oversight. They're trying to take jurisdiction," I said. "They can't, but they can annoy you to hell." He told me to keep cameras active and document everything. I didn't need convincing. I already had cameras hidden in the trees, on the barn, on the porch, and even in the old birdhouse facing the driveway. I wanted every angle covered. Later that evening, as I reviewed the camera footage, something caught my eye. A dark silhouette near the back of my land, not moving, watching, standing completely still for nearly a minute before slipping into the woods. Whoever it was, they knew where the cameras were or thought they did. But the floodlight near the barn caught enough to show a faint outline. One person. No vehicle, no dog, no visible tools. The next morning, I found footprints, dress shoes, not boots right where the figure had stood. Someone from the HOA board, most likely. They weren't inspecting. They were scouting. By noon, I'd driven into that HOA subdivision. I didn't confront anyone, I simply observed. Almost every yard had a campaign sign, "Re-elect President Callahan, protecting our community." So that was it. He wanted votes, a political win. And I was the villain he needed. Callahan's house was the only one without a sign. But when I drove by, I saw his curtain shift. Someone was watching me. Probably him. On my way out, a cruiser pulled behind me with flashing lights. A young officer stepped out. "We received a report from the HOA about aggressive behavior," he said flatly. I almost laughed. I haven't spoken to anyone. He wasn't interested in facts, just checking protocol. But when I mentioned Sheriff Daniels, his posture softened. "Have a good day, sir." He left as quickly as he arrived. I stood on my porch that night, watching the quiet land stretch out before me. The world looked peaceful, but nothing about it felt peaceful anymore. The HOA had begun building a story in which I was the threat, the troublemaker, the outsider. And once a story like that gains momentum, it becomes dangerous. The difference was they didn't know how prepared I was, and they had just crossed into the wrong man's territory. The first real escalation came early one morning when the sound of heavy machinery broke my sleep. At first I thought it was roadwork on the county stretch, but when I stepped onto my porch, the truth hit me in the chest like a hammer. A bright yellow utility truck sat near my property line, hazard lights flashing, and 2 more trucks were parked behind it. And standing right there, acting like land surveyors in a government training video, were 5 HOA members, including the smug king of the neighborhood, President Callahan. The workers they brought had stakes, cans of spray paint, and clipboards. One man hammered a wooden stake into the soil on my land. The sight of it boiled my blood hotter than any insult. They weren't hiding anymore. They were marching in broad daylight, trying to create the illusion of authority. I walked toward them calmly. When you deal with men who use paperwork as weapons, you don't show anger, you show control. "You're on my land," I said. Callahan flashed a grin that made my stomach tighten. "We're here to install a drainage maintenance system, county approved." "County approved?" I repeated. "Let me see." He handed over his clipboard reluctantly. The document wasn't a permit. Not even close. It was a petition he had drafted himself, stamped, signed by no one, no county letterhead. "You forged authority," I said. "It's preliminary action," he corrected, still smiling. "No, it's trespassing." He stepped closer, trying to intimidate. "Your land's runoff affects our homes. We're taking necessary steps to protect property values." "You're trespassing," I repeated. "Leave now." The workers looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. They knew they didn't have permission. The lead contractor spoke quietly. "We can't dig without county authorization." And with that, they began packing their tools. Callahan's face contorted in frustration, but he couldn't stop them. Before leaving, he leaned in close. "You can fight us all you want. It won't end well for you." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. That afternoon, Sheriff Daniels showed up again. "The HOA filed more complaints," he said, "alleging illegal grading, soil hazards, environmental risks." "They're manufacturing issues," I replied. "Exactly. They want the county to step in and restrict your land." I documented every inch of soil after he left. No hazards. No disturbances besides their vandalism. I saved every image. The next night, the new floodlight caught movement. At 1:47 a.m., a hooded figure crept near my barn. They crouched, reached into a backpack, and pulled out a large trash bag. When they opened it, I saw the metallic shine of paint cans. They were about to pour chemical paint into my soil, something that would trigger environmental fines. But the floodlight blasted on. The intruder panicked and sprinted into the woods, dropping the bag. Inside were 2 large cans of industrial enamel paint. Someone wasn't just trespassing, they were trying to sabotage my land. I called Daniels immediately. He arrived fast, looked at the footage, and his face hardened. "This is criminal," he said. "Someone tried to frame you." "Callahan," I said. "Maybe, but he'd send someone else." He gathered the evidence and said, "I'm opening a formal investigation." This just went from HOA stupidity to felony-level sabotage. When he left, I stood alone in the yard, the bag of abandoned poison still fresh in my mind. The HOA had started with trenching, then fake inspections, then surveillance. And now an attempt to poison my soil. This wasn't politics anymore. It was war. The next morning, a white county truck rolled slowly into my driveway. I hadn't expected anyone, and the quiet hum of the engine made the moment feel surreal. Out stepped a man in a beige uniform, a clipboard tucked under his arm. His expression was neutral, professional, as if he had seen everything and nothing surprised him anymore. "Morning," he said, extending his hand. "Robert Callan, County Land and Environmental Services." I shook it, noting the calm certainty in his gaze. "Morning." "Hear about the complaints?" I asked. He nodded, flipping open his clipboard and scanning the documents with a clinical detachment. "Yes. Alleged illegal grading, soil disturbance near eastern fence, water runoff concerns, and possible hazardous chemical storage." I gestured toward the barn. "Everything they're claiming is false. You'll see when we walk the property." He fell and stepped beside me, silent but alert, inspecting the soil, the grading, the foundation of the barn. When we reached the orange spray marks left by the HOA and the wooden stakes, he crouched, running a finger over the paint. "Fresh, not county issued, not applied by authorized personnel," he murmured, jotting notes quickly. We continued the perimeter, checking for drainage issues, pooling water, and potential chemical contamination. Everything was clean, exactly as it should be. "This looks good," he said finally, closing the clipboard. "I'll file the report today. Unless new evidence is presented, this property will be cleared of any violations." I felt relief but stayed wary. "New evidence?" He gave me a sharp look. "HOAs like this one don't give up. They can fabricate violations. Keep cameras running, log everything. Don't engage with them directly. If they try anything, we act on evidence." That night, reviewing my trail camera footage, I froze. At 1:47 a.m., a hooded figure had slipped past the trees, carrying a backpack and moving deliberately. They crouched near the barn, reached into the bag, and pulled out a large trash bag. The metallic glint of industrial paint cans inside told me instantly they were planning to leave false evidence, to manufacture a violation. The floodlight triggered, blinding them. They froze, then bolted into the woods, leaving the bag behind. I grabbed my shotgun and flashlight and inspected it carefully. 2 large paint cans lay in the bag. Whoever had attempted this had committed a criminal act. I called Sheriff Daniels immediately. Within 15 minutes, he arrived, reviewing the footage with a hard, calculating gaze. "This is criminal," he said. "They tried to sabotage your property, Callahan?" I asked, maybe, but he wouldn't do it himself. He'd send someone loyal or reckless enough to try it. Daniels carefully bagged the evidence, sealing the paint cans for the investigation. This just moved from HOA nonsense to criminal territory. Any further attempts will be treated very seriously. I watched him drive off, standing in the yard under the hum of the floodlight. The HOA had started a war, and I was ready to meet it on my terms. The following morning, I patrolled the property with a new level of vigilance. Every fence post, every tree line, and every corner was inspected. The trench, the stakes, and the abandoned paint cans had taught me a harsh lesson. The HOA didn't stop at intimidation. They escalated when unchecked. Sheriff Daniels called mid-morning, his voice calm but urgent. Callahan's board is rattled. They'll try other tactics, maybe through neighbors or fabricated complaints about noise or animals. Keep documenting everything, cameras, logs, photos. Stay out of direct confrontation. I reinforced my surveillance. Motion-activated cameras now covered every approach to the property, including the wooded back where the intruder had appeared. Floodlights were strategically placed to eliminate blind spots. The barn, the sheds, the driveway, even the garden were all monitored from a central screen inside the house. Every footstep, every movement would be recorded. When a silver sedan idled briefly at the edge of the road in front of my property, I logged the license plate. They were scouting, testing, and measuring how I would react. That night, around 1:52 a.m., a motion sensor near the back gate tripped. The floodlights snapped on, revealing two figures attempting to move stealthily across the yard. They froze, clearly surprised by the illumination, before retreating into the trees. I recorded their path and took notes in my log. This wasn't mere trespassing anymore. It was reconnaissance for potential sabotage. The HOA was probing, learning, testing boundaries. I contacted Daniels, who confirmed that any further trespass would be treated criminally. My property was fortified, my evidence documented, and my vigilance was heightened. By dawn, I had already planned further reinforcements, stronger locks on gates, extra chains, and additional cameras covering previously exposed areas. I was no longer simply defending land. I was establishing an impenetrable perimeter, turning my property into a fortress against manipulation and intimidation. The HOA's psychological warfare, designed to wear me down, had only made me sharper, more prepared, and more deliberate in every action. As the sun rose, casting light over the yard, I felt the weight of the previous week settle over me, but also a sense of control. The HOA had underestimated me. Assuming fear or exhaustion would force me to back down, they were wrong. Sheriff Daniels was involved, the evidence was clear, and I was ready for the next move. My land, my boundaries, my peace, these were non-negotiable. The following morning, the property felt deceptively calm. I walked the perimeter once more, boots crunching in the grass, checking for any signs of disturbance. Everything appeared normal, but I refused to trust appearances. The HOA had already escalated from trespassing to attempted sabotage, and they were patient, clever, and relentless. I contacted Daniels, who confirmed that Callahan's board was looking for any way to regain leverage, likely through neighbors, fake complaints, or more clandestine surveillance. Stay vigilant, he warned. Document everything and don't engage them directly. You're protected as long as you stay within the law. I spent the day reinforcing the property. Gates were secured with extra chains, floodlights were adjusted for maximum coverage, and cameras were repositioned to cover blind spots along the fence lines and wooded areas. The barn and sheds were checked for vulnerabilities, and every potential entry point was logged. I reviewed footage from the previous night, noting movement near the far fence, two figures, backpacks in hand, attempting to remain undetected. Motion sensors had triggered lights and alarms, sending them retreating. Every detail, direction, speed, footwear was recorded for Daniels. As night fell, the tension was palpable. I sat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, watching the property stretch into the dark. The floodlights cast stark shadows, illuminating the barn and fence posts in sharp relief. I reflected on the trench, the painted stakes, and the failed contamination attempt. Each act by the HOA had failed, yet each had only heightened my awareness and readiness. At 2:10 a.m., a motion sensor flashed. Shadows darted across the yard, clearly caught off guard by the lights. They fled into the woods, leaving footprints that I logged meticulously. By sunrise, I had a plan: continue reinforcing fences, set additional cameras, and maintain a network of observation points to ensure no one could enter undetected. This was no longer a simple land dispute. It was a calculated campaign of intimidation. The HOA had tried psychological and physical tactics to unsettle me, but I had adapted, fortifying my defenses, documenting evidence, and coordinating with law enforcement. By the time the sun bathed the yard in morning light, I was exhausted but resolute. The HOA might escalate, but I was prepared. My land, my boundaries, and my peace were protected, and I would meet every attempt with preparedness, vigilance, and the law. They had tested me, but I was no longer the passive target. The day started like any other, with sunlight spilling across the yard, but there was an undercurrent of tension I could feel in my chest. I moved deliberately, walking the perimeter, inspecting fences, gates, and the tree line bordering the property. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't let appearances fool me. The HOA had already escalated beyond mere trespassing. They had dug trenches, planted stakes, tried to contaminate my soil, and tested my patience with fake complaints. Today, I knew they would attempt something more overt. I reviewed my logs from the previous weeks, cross-checking timestamps with camera footage and sensor alerts. Every movement, every vehicle, every sound had been meticulously recorded. The sheriff had advised me that evidence was now my strongest weapon. By late morning, a black SUV slowly approached my driveway. I recognized it immediately: Callahan's car. The same smug expression, the same confidence and entitlement, now masked in a businesslike exterior. He stepped out, carrying a clipboard, and gave me a wide, forced smile. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth, almost too friendly. "I thought we could have a discussion about the drainage and environmental concerns." I gestured toward the porch. "I'm listening. But remember, no one touches this property without permission." He waved the comment away. Of course. I'm here to talk things over." I didn't invite him in. I didn't need to. "I've documented everything," I said firmly. "Every intrusion, every trench, every paint can. Sheriff Daniels has the files. Any further trespass is criminal." His smile faltered slightly. "We're just trying to protect the community. You must understand neighbors are concerned." I shook my head. "You're not protecting anything. You're trespassing, sabotaging, and harassing me. That's the issue." His expression hardened. "I assure you, we are following county protocols." I crossed my arms. "I've spoken with the county inspector. He cleared the property. Any claims from the HOA that contradict that are false." Callahan's eyes flickered toward the yard, and I knew he was counting the cameras, the sensors, the floodlights. He was realizing, just slightly, that I wasn't intimidated. By afternoon, the tension escalated further. My trail cameras caught two figures near the far fence, attempting to approach unnoticed. They crouched low, whispering, backpacks at their sides, likely trying to gather materials for another sabotage. I called Daniels immediately. Within 20 minutes, sheriff vehicles were pulling up, lights flashing in broad daylight. The intruders froze, realizing they were caught on camera and in person. They bolted, tripping over the uneven soil, leaving behind a small set of tools and notebooks filled with measurements. Daniels inspected the items with me. "They're serious," he said, "but they aren't as careful as they think. Every failed attempt works in your favor legally." I watched as Callahan, who had lingered nearby, waved dismissively toward the intruders. "They're just trying to do their jobs," he muttered under his breath. Daniel spun toward him, face darkening. "Don't test me, Callahan." These people were trespassing and preparing to commit a crime. You're legally responsible if anyone on your board orchestrated this. Callahan's face tightened, but he didn't argue. For the first time, I saw a flash of real concern cross his features. Later that night, I reviewed the footage from the day. The two intruders had scouted my barn, measured distances, and even marked points with small chalk lines. Had it been left unchecked, it could have been spun into another false claim. I logged everything, adding notes about Callahan's presence, his vehicle, and his attempts to minimize what was clearly trespassing and potential sabotage. I sent copies to Daniels. He replied quickly, "This evidence is strong. Subpoenas are being prepared. The county is aware. Any future attempts will have legal consequences." I felt a rare mix of relief and vigilance. The HOA had escalated again, but the combination of documentation, surveillance, and law enforcement involvement had shifted the power dynamic. I was no longer just defending my property. I had moved into a legal and procedural position where every action they took could be held against them. Callahan's arrogance had finally met boundaries that couldn't be ignored. By the next morning, I reinforced the perimeter further. Gates were secured, cameras adjusted, and floodlights tested for full coverage. I knew the HOA might attempt another intrusion, but every point of access was now monitored. My logs were meticulous, detailing every interaction, every sighting, and every communication. I felt a sense of control that I hadn't had in weeks. The HOA's intimidation tactics had failed repeatedly. They had misjudged my resolve, my preparation, and the involvement of Daniels and the county. Late that afternoon, Daniels arrived again for a site visit. "The HOA isn't going to stop," he said bluntly, scanning the property. "But with this evidence, they can't operate without consequences. Callahan may try political maneuvers, but legally, they've painted themselves into a corner." I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The sheriff's presence, combined with my surveillance network, meant that any future attempt at harassment or sabotage could be dealt with decisively. By nightfall, I sat on the porch, shotgun within reach, watching the yard stretch into the darkness. Floodlights cut long shadows across the grass and barn, cameras blinking silently. The HOA's next move might come, but it wouldn't succeed. I have law enforcement, documentation, and vigilance on my side. Callahan had tried to bully, sabotage, and intimidate me, but he had underestimated the level of preparation and determination he was facing. The battle for my land, my peace, and my rights was far from over, but I was no longer the passive target. I was ready for whatever came next. The morning air carried a crisp edge, and the yard glistened with dew, but the calm was deceptive. I moved through the property methodically, checking every gate, fence line, and tree cluster for signs of intrusion. Every disturbance from the past weeks, trenches, painted stakes, abandoned paint cans, and failed reconnaissance, was still fresh in my mind. The HOA had been emboldened by the assumption that I would tolerate their harassment. But now that the sheriff and county had stepped in, they were frustrated, reckless, and increasingly desperate. I reviewed my logs again, cross-checking the camera footage from the previous night. The two intruders caught approaching the back gate had left a faint trail in the soft soil. I noted the path, footwear type, and estimated height. Every detail mattered. By late morning, my phone rang. It was Daniels. "They're escalating," he said, his tone serious. "Callahan and his board are likely planning one last push before legal consequences catch up with them. Be extra vigilant today. Expect overt actions, attempted tampering, or reconnaissance, maybe even aggressive confrontation. Document everything." "No exceptions," I agreed, even as a tight knot formed in my stomach. The HOA wasn't just stubborn anymore, they were dangerous in their desperation. By noon, a black SUV slowed at the edge of my property, its tinted windows hiding the driver. I recognized it immediately. Callahan. He stepped out, clipboard in hand, giving me a casual wave that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "Good day," he said smoothly. I thought we could discuss potential community concerns. I didn't invite him closer. "I've documented everything," I said, gesturing to the cameras and floodlights. "Any further trespass is criminal. Sheriff Daniels is aware." "Don't test that." His smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "We're only trying to resolve this amicably." Amicably, I thought, as if leaving my property alone and stopping sabotage were matters of negotiation. I shook my head. "You've already crossed the line too many times. Community concerns don't justify trespass or tampering." He made a dismissive motion toward the yard, clearly frustrated by the cameras and sensors now visible from multiple angles. He didn't argue further, but I saw him make a quick call on his phone, probably rallying some accomplices for another attempt. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of escalation arrived. My cameras caught two figures approaching from the tree line near the back fence. They moved quickly, scanning for blind spots, backpacks in hand. I called Daniels, who assured me that a unit was en route. Within 15 minutes, patrol cars rolled onto the property, lights flashing. The intruders froze, realizing they were caught in the open. They abandoned their backpacks and fled, leaving behind a set of tools, notebooks, and what appeared to be small stakes and marking paint. Daniels collected the evidence, taking detailed photographs and sealing it for the investigation. Meanwhile, Callahan had watched from his SUV, his expression unreadable. Daniels stepped forward, voice sharp. "These individuals were trespassing and preparing to commit a crime. If anyone coordinated this, the responsibility falls on them, on you, Callahan." Callahan's eyes flickered nervously. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his calculated intimidation tactics had a legal and procedural cost. He opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel silenced him with a cold stare. "Save it. This isn't a negotiation. Any future actions on your part or the HOAs will have consequences." By evening, the yard felt eerily quiet. I checked the cameras and motion sensors again, ensuring every corner, gate, and fence line was monitored. The floodlights cast long shadows, turning the barn and sheds into stark silhouettes. I walked the perimeter, making notes of weak points I could reinforce overnight. Every inch had to be protected. The HOA had tried intimidation, sabotage, and psychological warfare, but I had countered every move. My logs were thorough, my evidence airtight, and the sheriff's involvement added weight that could not be ignored. Late at night, I sat on the porch, shotgun across my lap, and reviewed the footage of the day's events. The intruders' markings, the abandoned tools, and the failed approach all confirmed what I already suspected. Callahan was desperate. He had realized that his previous tactics were no longer effective and had escalated to more aggressive measures, likely hoping that fear or frustration might push me into overreacting. But I had prepared for this. Every step I took, every precaution I implemented, had been calculated to prevent exactly this scenario. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensors triggered again. Shadows flitted near the far back fence, moving cautiously but deliberately. I observed through binoculars, noting their path. The intruders hesitated, unsure of the coverage, and the floodlights now illuminating every angle. My cameras captured everything, every movement, every attempt at stealth. I could see panic begin to creep into their actions, and I knew the sheriff's deputies were minutes away. Within moments, the intruders bolted, leaving evidence behind once more. Daniels arrived promptly, documenting the scene, inspecting the abandoned items, and noting the path they had taken. By dawn, I had reinforced gates, repositioned cameras, and set additional motion sensors. Every potential point of access was now secured and monitored. The HOA's desperation had reached its peak, but they had failed again. Legal consequences were looming. The county and sheriff were fully involved. Evidence was documented, and my property was fortified. Callahan and his board had underestimated my vigilance and the strength of the law on my side. I finally allowed myself to breathe, standing on the porch as sunlight bathed the yard in gold. Floodlights, cameras, and logs ensured that any future attempts would be caught immediately. The HOA had tested me, tried intimidation and sabotage, and escalated recklessly. But every move they had made had only strengthened my position. My land, my peace, and my rights were fully protected. And now, with law enforcement and documented evidence on my side, the HOA's desperation could no longer threaten them or me. The morning was crisp and still, almost impossibly calm after weeks of chaos. But I knew better than to trust appearances. Every footstep, every shadow, and every sound had to be scrutinized. The past weeks had been a relentless battle. Trenches dug overnight, painted stakes planted, chemicals left to manufacture violations, and intruders scouting the property under cover of darkness. The HOA, driven by desperation and hubris, had escalated to a point where law enforcement was fully involved. Sheriff Daniels had warned me that today, more than ever, vigilance would be my strongest ally. By mid-morning, a black SUV appeared at the edge of the road, moving unusually slowly. I recognized it instantly. Callahan, his expression taut with determination, clipboard in hand. He stepped out, voice calm but forced. "I thought we could discuss resolving these ongoing concerns," he said, as though politeness could erase weeks of harassment. I didn't move from the porch. "I've documented everything. Trespass, sabotage, intimidation, all of it. Sheriff Daniels is aware. Any further attempt on your part or your board's will have legal consequences." His smile faltered slightly, the first real sign of uncertainty I had seen in him. He made a half-hearted wave toward the yard, then stepped back into the SUV. Minutes later, I noticed movement near the far fence. Two figures were approaching stealthily, backpacks in hand, clearly attempting reconnaissance. I grabbed my phone and called Daniels. Within 10 minutes, deputies were on site. The intruders froze when they realized the property was swarming with law enforcement and illuminated by floodlights. They abandoned their equipment tools, chalk, stakes, and fled into the woods. Daniels inspected the items, documenting every detail meticulously. "This is the final straw," he said. "The county is issuing subpoenas, and the HOA board will be held accountable for orchestrating these criminal actions." By afternoon, legal notices arrived at my doorstep. Callahan and his board had been formally summoned. The complaints against me were dismissed, and a county investigation confirmed my property was compliant with all regulations. Callahan's attempts at intimidation and sabotage had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed legally and publicly. I walked the property, noting the freshly installed stakes for cameras and floodlights, the logs documenting every trespass, and the secure gates. This was no longer just land protection. It was a record of my persistence, foresight, and ability to defend myself within the law. That evening, Callahan appeared again, this time with a lawyer. Their approach was careful, calculating, but I could see the tension behind the eyes. Daniels was present, monitoring from a distance, ensuring no further trespass occurred. Callahan attempted to negotiate, speaking in calm tones about community concerns and finding compromise. I remained firm. "There will be no compromise on harassment, trespass, or intimidation. My property, my peace, and my legal rights are protected. You've been documented, and the law is now involved. Any further attempt will result in criminal charges." The lawyer tried to interject, but Daniels stepped forward, making clear the consequences of any misstep. By nightfall, the property felt quieter than it had in weeks. I walked the perimeter one final time, inspecting fences, gates, floodlights, and cameras. Every angle was covered, every approach monitored. My logs were complete, recording every interaction, every vehicle, and every attempt at sabotage. The HOA had been relentless, but they had underestimated my preparation, my vigilance, and the legal safeguards now firmly in place. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control, a quiet satisfaction that justice was not only possible, but inevitable. The sheriff called later that night to update me. The subpoenas are in motion. Callahan and the board are aware that any further harassment could result in criminal charges. They've been warned. From here on, everything you've documented is evidence that protects you completely. I thanked him, feeling the weight of weeks of tension lift slightly. The property was no longer just land. It was a symbol of resilience, preparation, and lawful defense. In the following days, legal proceedings moved quickly. Callahan and the board faced hearings that exposed their repeated attempts to harass and sabotage me. Testimonies, camera footage, and documentation were presented. Each lie, each failed attempt, each trespass was laid bare in the courtroom. The HOS reputation was severely damaged, and the legal consequences were clear: fines, oversight, and restrictions on their ability to enforce rules on my property. I watched from the sidelines, satisfied, knowing that months of intimidation had finally ended in accountability. By the end of the month, the property was peaceful. The floodlights remained on, cameras silently recording, and gates secured. I spent the evening on the porch, shotgun nearby, reviewing the logs one last time. Each entry, each photograph, each timestamp was a testament to persistence, vigilance, and the importance of defending one's rights. The HOO had tried everything: intimidation, sabotage, and manipulation. They had underestimated me at every turn. As the sun set over the yard, casting long shadows across the barn and the fences, I felt a profound sense of victory. The HOA had been stopped, their attempts nullified, and my property fully protected. The combination of documentation, surveillance, and law enforcement had turned the tide. Callahan and his board had learned a hard lesson: boundaries, law, and perseverance cannot be ignored. I finally allowed myself to relax, standing on the porch and surveying the land. The floodlights hummed quietly, the cameras blinked, and the barn stood solid and unchallenged. My property, my peace, and my legal rights were secured. Every intrusion, every sabotage attempt, and every false complaint had only strengthened my position. The HOA had tried to dominate, to intimidate, and to manipulate. They had failed. And now, at last, the land, the law, and my vigilance had triumphed.